Again, as always, this course was designed to be useful in terms of what's going on in the immediate future, in the immediate situation, and even just today, an extraordinary array of events. Basically, the United States today told the largest largest automobile companies in the United States what to do. They basically fired the head of General Motors. They didn't basically fire. They fired the head of General Motors. There's nothing basic about it. Mr. Ratner, who's the chief government agent and overseeing all of this, told Mr. Wagner, I believe is how you pronounce his name, that he would have to go. And they decided who would replace him. It's important that you understand this, because when we get to solutions, it is a testimony to the power of private enterprise at this point in the United States. That is, it's a testimony to how little they have power left, these private corporations. They can't even figure out who's running the company, because that would be explained to them the next day. I don't know whether Mr. Wagner was informed before he read it in the newspaper, but not much before. Since the report on the basis of which this was done was a report that was finished over the weekend, so he couldn't have had more than 24 hours notice that his tenure as chief, and he's been chief for a bunch of years, I don't know exactly how long it was. Just as important is what they told the Chrysler Corporation, the third largest automobile company in the United States. They were told that they have, I am not making this up, 30 days, they were told, to basically collapse into a subdivision of the Italian company Fiat, of which they will become a subsidiary. If they don't do that, then it was ... No? If you don't do that, ... And the ... dots are all bad. Although they're not exactly spelled out, so I can't tell you, but it sounds really bad. They're not going to get any credit. And what the financial press believes is that if they don't cut a deal with Fiat, then they will go bankrupt. They will be allowed to formally go bankrupt, which has all kinds of legal and financial implications, particularly worrisome for trade unions. Because under American law, if a corporation goes bankrupt, the law allows the bankruptcy judge, if you go bankrupt, you basically turn over your business to a judge in a court. And the judge in the court then has to settle your affairs in whatever way he thinks is appropriate. But in doing so, he no longer has to recognize legally the contracts entered into by the now bankrupt entity. It's as if the signatures of the executives on the contracts they signed up to the point they were bankrupt no longer have legal weight. They don't count. Well, the most important contract from the point of view of the workers is the contract that governs the labor relations. You know, how many people are working here, what do you get paid, what are your benefits, and all that is now abrogated. And basically, the new person brought in, typically called a receiver, because that person receives the enterprise from the people who had it before, because bankruptcy transfers it now. The judge declares a receiver, and the receiver does not have to honor the contracts with the labor unions. They can literally say, well, as of tomorrow, your salary is half what it was last week. And there's no legal prevention of that, no legal obstacle to doing that. The union can strike and there can be all kinds of trouble, but legally, this is what can happen. It's also the case that they can, by declaring bankruptcy, all the smaller companies that provide Chrysler, you know, with ashtrays for the car and for the little floor mats, and all the littler companies that provide inputs to the big ones. All large automobile companies buy tons of their stuff from small independent companies. They all have contracts. Those contracts are also now null and void. And therefore, for example, if a small company is owed a ton of money, they just wait in line to see whether they get anything. And the judge will decide whether they get dollar for dollar on what's owed them, or 50 cents on the dollar, or 3 cents on the dollar, depending on how the assets of this company are distributed. So Chrysler now has 30 days. Now imagine yourself to be the head of Fiat. What kind of contract discussion is this? Either you make a deal, says Fiat with me, or I know what happens to you, you're going to die. Which means the deal that Fiat is about to get It's gotten much better. And what Chrysler has to give is everything. Yeah.
How they settle on Fiat? Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know enough about it. Does anyone here follow this more
I
closely
think it
than I
was
do?
just because Fiat said that they were willing to pay.
That was going to be my guess, that it isn't so much that they picked Fiat, but that Fiat was the only one who said, okay, well, I'll do something with this.
I think they had been talking also.
In the past, yes. They all these all the automobile, that's what I'm going to get to in a few minutes. All the automobile companies are talking to each other because they're all in desperate trouble. Everyone in the world is in desperate trouble. Even the Japanese companies, but everybody else for sure, the Japanese also. There is a vast overcapacity, it's called, a vastly larger capacity to produce cars in the world today than there is any conceivable demand for it. So you have a situation where all the companies are dying as they all can't survive on the portion of the shrinking demand that is available. Another thing was the government began redesigning what Fannie Mae and what Freddie Mac are going to be doing in the years ahead. And that's also another sign that the basic corporate decisions are now being made by the government running these enterprises. AIG, Fannie Mae, and these are gigantic, hundreds of billions of dollars of operations. We're talking about the government becoming a major player in what used to be private enterprise. For those of you not familiar, that's the norm in many parts of the world. It's just not the norm here. So that more and more businesses are run by the government as a matter of course, which makes all the decisions, determines who's the executive, determines what policies are going to be followed, what payouts of dividends, if any, are going to be made. All of that is being done by a growing apparatus of government officials that are running the enterprise. Yeah, anyone not yet? What was that? Okay. All right. So let's turn to how all of this plays out with the third world. Now, obviously, I can't be comprehensive in all of this. Every third world country is unique, has its own history, its own economic particularities, and so what I'm going to be saying is a generalized statement, but it would have to be adjusted for any particular part of the world or any particular country. I want to begin by talking about how in the last 30 years particularly, even more than before, two phenomena intertwine in the third world in a dramatic way. And again, I'm going to overstate the case, but to make the points clear. Before the 1970s, in general, most third world countries were used to exporting to the industrialized part of the world, but the things they mostly exported, and I'll talk about the exceptions in a minute, the things they mostly exported were food, raw materials, minerals, metals, agricultural products, you might say, inputs, either to sustaining the people in the more advanced world, food, or sustaining production in the advanced world, inputs, raw inputs, oil, cotton, coffee, tin, all of that. There were some exceptions, of course. There were various third world countries that did not want to play the role, if I can be dramatic, of hewers of wood and drawers of water, as the Bible has it. They didn't want to be the kind of primitive producers for the more developed part of the world. They wanted to develop some industry, some production of their own. Some countries went quite far in that, others didn't. Some examples of countries that had gone quite a ways in that. India had gone in its way quite a ways in that, developed an independent business class originating out of the merchants in India, but they really took off with independence. In fact, if you look back at the history of many third world countries, a key moment was the break from being a formal colony to becoming independent, which in many parts of the world happened at the end of World War II. happened at the end of World War II because the old colonial powers had exhausted themselves by shooting at each other. And we're not in a position